Good. Thank you. Good morning. John, thank you for that kind introduction. I've got to say, of all the introductions I've ever had, that was the most recent. So I'm really grateful for it. So good to be with all of you. I wanted to start really by kind of giving a little bit of a background, as I understand it, of why we're doing it. This is my second year in a row being a part of this event, which is really an honor. Thank you to Bishop Felix and so many others that have been a part of this and have the vision for this. But excuse me, after the end of the last one, I was so blown away by a flurry of questions that came in to the various topics that we were addressing in the conference, and which I love. I grew up in a situation where sometimes asking questions, particularly hard ones, was frowned upon. Where sometimes it was assumed that questioning means doubting and doubting means sinning. Just this week, there was a podcast with the New York Times. It's one that I listen to most days. It's called The Daily. And it was talking about this crazy movement that I had not heard of. I don't know if any of you have heard of it. It's called Birds Aren't Real. Birds aren't real. Birds aren't real is a intentional conspiracy theory. It was a movement started by this kid in Memphis, Tennessee, and he was walking downtown Memphis, where there was a women's march. I think this was back in like 2017, maybe right after, maybe 2016. It was somewhere in that neighborhood. There was a women's march, and then there was a counter protest that was more political from some Trump supporters. And he, in a kind of a snarky moment of sarcasm, grabbed a piece of cardboard, flipped it over, and as he said it on the podcast, wrote the first three things that came into his mind, which are birds aren't real. And the protesters who were there to protest surrounded him and started to ask, what does this mean? What are you talking about? And he started to make up this movement on the spot that birds were all destroyed by the US government back in the 70s, have been replaced by surveillance drones that power themselves because of the power lines. And it just got out of hand. And suddenly people started to write birds aren't real on the board of their classrooms. They started to make t-shirts, and he started to realize, hey, maybe there's an opportunity in this. He started an Instagram page or an Instagram account that became the home of it, started to show up at any protest ever, and then sell a whole lot of merchandise. And it's kind of become not really a protest. He doesn't believe it. He doesn't believe it at all. No, most people don't believe it. Apparently, though, there are a handful of people who actually believe that birds aren't real and they actually are surveillance drones. And this whole movement has become kind of a relief to the. It's become kind of a breath of funny, fresh air in a culture where everything is protested and everything is considered to be worth fighting over. Friedrich Nietzsche, the atheist philosopher, once said that all truths were bloody truths to him. In other words, if he believed it, then he was going to fight over it and die over it. And look, we fight over everything in our culture. Some things are worth fighting for. A lot of things that we fight about aren't. And in that sort of culture, this 20-something-year-old kid just kind of decided that he was going to start this thing or let this thing kind of get out of hand and get out of control, because it's kind of a breath of fresh air. My favorite is he went to St. Louis and he held a flag burning of the St. Louis Cardinals, the baseball team flag, because it treated birds as real. I thought that was actually a pretty funny way to do it. What was interesting, though, is he's been in character now for 4 or 5 years, since 2017. So he actually, has this character, really pretending that he's this guy who does not believe that birds are real and that he's skeptical of the surveillance technology and so on. But in this New York Times podcast, he came clean. He came clean and said, this is who I am. This is the story behind it. And he grew up in a Christian home, very, very conservative, very, very fundamentalist Christian home. And his story is, and look, I don't know if this is true. We sometimes tell our own stories correctly, and sometimes we embellish our own stories. But His story was that when he was about 10 or 11 years old, he went to his youth pastor and he said, "I'm not sure that I believe in God." And the answer wasn't to take his doubts seriously, to allow him to ask the really hard questions that he had about life in the world. But the answer, or the response to this young man, was for the youth pastor to say, "You're possessed by a demon." In other words, in that situation, questioning means doubting and doubting means sinning. Now, what's happened now is, I'm not saying that the birds aren't real thing isn't actually kind of funny, and it isn't actually a nice breath of fresh air and a relief. But now he takes this fake protest everywhere. And in the podcast, he talks about going to a pro-life event where people are actually debating and talking, both protesters and counter protesters, about an issue like abortion. Now, that's one of those issues that creates an awful lot of heat in our culture, but it's also one of those issues that's really, really important, because if it is indeed true that preborn babies in the womb are indeed human, are indeed persons, are indeed image bearers of God, then to take their lives, this is an issue of life and death. If they're not, then the government restricting abortion rights in any way is a restriction on personal freedom. And that's something that is also worthy of concern. In other words, it's one thing to create a movement where you're trying to get a breath of fresh air from the issues that matter. It's another thing to take that movement and then treat the issues that matter as if they don't matter. And see, this is the real danger. It's a real danger of not having one's questions taken seriously. G.K. Chesterton put it this way. He said, when you stop believing in God, the problem isn't that you believe in nothing. The problem is that you believe in anything. I think, though, however, that in our cultural moment, there's a real tendency towards cynicism. Didn't start, by the way, with the Gen Zers, the current crop of young people. It started with my generation, the Gen Xers. We were a real cynical bunch. We had everything that we could possibly want. In the 90s, in America, we had way too much money. We had way too much peace. If that is even possible, the Cold War was over. The conflicts around the rest of the world, which were very, very real, were not on our radar here in the United States. I remember being in a class my freshman year in college in the 1990s and I think we were talking about World War II. And I remember thinking to myself, I can't possibly imagine the world ever going to war again. I mean, because what I completely failed to realize is there were incredible conflicts happening around the world at that moment. But in the West, man, we were fat and happy. We were rich. We were wealthy. Our biggest concern was what a president did with an intern in the Oval Office. That dominated the entire decade. That was the only thing that happened. We had these illusions. And you know what happened was, it's interesting. When we had everything that we wanted, we didn't become better people. We became a cynical bunch. That was Gen Xers. We were known for grunge. We were known for cynicism, Kurt Cobain. And if you don't know any of these names, don't Google it. It's just an example. There was a real cynicism. And I think that whereas G.K. Chesterton decades earlier said, when you lose sight of God, you're tempted to believe in anything or believe everything. I think really what we've seen in the latter part of the 20th century and now into this one is, if you stop believing in God, a real temptation is just to think that no beliefs are worth it. It's not worth it at all to really plant your feet somewhere. So here we were a year ago at this event, which was really wonderful and had such a great set of conversations. And man, I was so excited about it for a number of reasons. One was just the interaction and the number of questions that poured in that day from people that were watching that asked some really important questions, and we just didn't have time to get to them. And I was really concerned. Some of the questions didn't have to do with how should a Christian think about this. A lot of the questions had to do with, well, Christians say this, but how do we even know that's true? How do you even know that? There's questions about, whether which story of the world, the Christian story of the world or an atheistic story of the world were true, and about the truthfulness of Scripture. And man, aren't Christians intolerant for believing what they believe about homosexuality or marriage or the issue of gender? And you know what? I never, ever, ever want to give anyone who is an honest questioner the impression that questioning is doubting and doubting is sinning. If that is true, you have to take the entire book of Psalms out of the Bible and pretend it wasn't there. What's fascinating, the book of Psalms it was Israel's hymn book. And you can go from Psalm to Psalm to Psalm. And there's a lot of Psalms that are like, God is great and he rescued us and let's praise him. And there's a lot of Psalms that are like, God, you say this, but in my life, I see this. It doesn't match. What the heck? Now that's my generous John Stonestreet translation of the Psalms, where basically God allows his people to ask these really hard questions, especially about his goodness, even about his trustworthiness. And if it was okay back in that day to ask questions about that, we live in a cultural setting right now where I think maybe the most significant question we struggle with is that one. Who should I trust? In different cultural moments and different settings, different questions rise to the surface. If you grew up or ever found yourself in a particular place in which there was a great calamity, maybe a war, maybe a great evil like a genocide. This is what happened to the Jewish people after the Holocaust. The question that rose to the forefront in their cultural moment was, how can God let these bad things happen? In other words, because of the cultural chaos around them, that question became the most important question for that people. We've got lots of questions that are rising to the surface. I think, though, that one of the most important ones is reflecting the world that we live in, what historians and sociologists call the age of information. The age of information is different than any age that any generation has ever been through in all of human history. We are moving in a global way out of an industrial age into an information age. And I know I'm doing some history here. Hopefully it'll make sense, because I think it's really important. You can read through history about the Industrial Revolution in Western culture. And now the Industrial Revolution obviously has become the dominant force around not only the Western world, but the rest of the world as well. And this is a time in which the center of our societies move from farms to factories. They move from the country to the city. And it changes everything. It changes how we have to do education. It changes how we have to do economics. It changes how we have to do government. And it's messy. There's a lot of stuff that came as the Industrial Revolution. Well, look, that shift from an agrarian or farm-based world to an industrial-based world, we're now going through another shift from an industrial-based world to an information-based world, in which we have an incredible amount of information at our fingertips at all times. That's what this thing does. Questions and positions that would have never been big questions for us are now really big questions for us. I'll give you an example of this, just how much things have changed in just a short amount of time. When I first started teaching and speaking, one of the things I like to do would be go to a group of young people and pretend to be an atheist. I called it the devil's advocate. I'm not the only one that does it, by the way. Our speaker later on, Abdu Murray, who's really one of the great thinkers. You guys are really blessed to have Abdu. He's a good friend, and so thankful, Barnabas and others, for making that available for him to be here. You're going to be able to ask him any question. I'm going to tell you in this talk, it's okay to ask questions. And then what you're supposed to do is ask all the really hard questions to Abdu. Okay. So that's how we're going to do this. All right. That's how we want to do it. But several years ago, one of the things that I often would do is I would go to students, at a youth group or something like that, and pretend to be an atheist. And I did it for a couple of reasons. Number one is I wanted to bring up a lot of the questions that I knew that these students had, and then let's address them. And that's a way to bring it up, those questions. Another one is, it was kind of an edgy sort of thing to do. Well, one time I was asking, I came to this group and I told the guy, don't introduce me at all. I'm just going to come in and pretend to be an atheist. And he was game for it. And you never know where it's going to go. Sometimes the students, really are the students want to talk about the problem of evil and suffering, or maybe they want to talk about, how do we know the Bible is true? This was one of those places. It went down that path about whether the Bible can be trusted or not. And afterwards, the guy who had invited me got really upset. He goes, now I'm going to have to spend a whole week talking about why the Bible can be trusted. And I said, well, wait a minute. Aren't you glad you know that? Aren't you glad that you're going to be able to address this? And you've got an audience now that wants to know these answers. And see, what happened was in that time is I was bringing up challenges against the reliability of the Bible that skeptics and atheists and cynics often bring up. These students had never heard about that because this was back in the early 90s where, you just wouldn't hear those things if you grew up in a kind of a sheltered environment. That happened to me. I grew up in a Christian home, went to a Christian school, had a Christian youth group. My freshman year in college, I was taught that the miracles in the Gospels have been fabricated in order to embellish Jesus's story. And I've been in church my whole life. I'd never heard that, and I had nothing to respond with. Now it's different because of this thing and because of videos of guys like Bill Maher, guys, skeptics or cynics, or because of the constant videos that we get from The View or something like that. All the cynicism and the skepticism and all the challenges to either traditional morality or to the Bible, we are confronted with them all the time. In other words, one of the differences for you is you have access to all these other ways of thinking about life in the world that those of us who grew up in the 80s and 90s didn't have. We might have met an atheist on the street, but we didn't encounter, for example, Richard Dawkins, or we didn't encounter, some of the most outspoken advocates for, same-sex marriage or the transgender view or something like that. In other words, this thing has made all of those questions and put all of those questions up front and personal right in front of our own face. So now we have a different world to deal with. I care deeply about our church. I care deeply about what God is doing with the Church of Nigeria in America. I care deeply that we have a future. We need it. And that's why coming out of last year's conference and seeing all of those questions just pile up, good questions, by the way, that have answers. And I think that's one of the things you'll see in this our time today is that these questions, even the ones that I've brought up today, where is God? How can God let bad things happen? How do we know the Bible can be trusted? And what about, these issues? Isn't having a view of marriage that comes from the Bible, isn't that intolerant? And isn't that hateful? I think you can fit all of these challenges kind of into two categories. Number one is Christianity true? And number two is Christianity good? Is Christianity true? And is Christianity good? If you have those questions, I just want you to know, ask away. I hope we'll get to them all. My guess is we won't if it was anything like last year, which is great. Ask the hard questions. The Bible takes our questions seriously. If you don't believe it, look at the book of Psalms. Look at Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes is a book in which Solomon goes on a philosophical journey. And if you know any of the kind of the big kind of categories of philosophical thought, how people have tried to understand life in the world, you'll see he kind of goes on a journey through all of them. He struggles with despair. He struggles with hedonism, just living out of pleasure. These things are taken seriously. The Bible, even in the life of Jesus, he takes people's questions seriously. So seriously, Jesus takes people's questions so seriously that when people come to Jesus with a question, most of the time he responds with a better question. In other words, a question that makes their question even more powerful and even better, and then wrestles with that with them. This is This is what you need to know. But I do want you to understand something as you ask these questions, which we absolutely welcome today. I want you to know something, that one of the important things that the Bible does distinguish, and I think it's spot on for making this distinction, is the difference between an honest questioner and a dishonest questioner. The language that is used in Proverbs is the difference between a seeker and a mocker. Someone who seeks is someone who actually has legitimate questions, born out of personal experience or born out of kind of a mental disconnect that they're trying to make sense of the world. God made you to make sense of the world. It's okay to do that. But a seeker is trying to find answers to those questions. A different group of people, however, the Bible, particularly in Proverbs, describes as mockers. The mocker has already decided an answer, and he's asking a question to be snarky. He's asking a question to be cynical. He's asking a question in order to prove something he's already decided. Now, here's the challenge about being a mocker. If you're a mocker, if you've already decided, then if the truth did smack you in the face, if the truth didn't land in your lap, you wouldn't even know it. You've already given up the possibility that an answer is possible. So just because you ask a question today, and again, I hope you do, and just because an answer is given to you, it doesn't mean that it will make you feel better about a particularly hard time or some sort of circumstance. And it doesn't mean it will convince you. It's fascinating. If you go to a court of law, courts don't ask the lawyers to convince the jury beyond a shadow of a doubt. That's because that's possible. Or that's because that's impossible. Sorry. You can't convince someone beyond a shadow of a doubt. You have to convince them beyond reasonable doubt. And if there's reasonable doubt, then someone cannot be convicted. I think the same thing is true here in our journey together today. And that is if you've already decided that the only way that you're going to take these truth claims that come from Christianity, that come from the life of Jesus, that come from the teachings of the law and the Old Testament and the New Testament and Jesus and the moral claims that the Bible makes on our life because of how it describes life in the world, and you decide that no, the only way that you're going to believe this stuff is if it changes your mind or makes you feel better, then you're looking at this the wrong way. You've got to decide, am I open to this claim of Jesus on our life? Are we really willing to consider these claims up front? If there's a good answer, will you actually believe it? That has less to do with the one making the case for whatever it is that we're talking about. It has something a lot more to do with one receiving it. It's fascinating that those who clamor in our culture today and clamor most for having an open mind are very often the ones that have the most closed minds that are there. It's fascinating that those who claim that we need to have tolerance, that all views need to be considered, are often the ones that are the most intolerant of a view that disagrees with them. You need to understand that, because we're going to look at a lot of issues these days. Today, we're going to look at a lot of issues in culture. We're going to look at the questions that these issues bring up, and we want to open up these questions and these issues for you. But there's a couple things that we want to know in order to stay on the side of a seeker and not kind of punt to being a mocker. All right. The first thing you need to know is that all of these questions, all of these issues, whether we're talking about, kind of philosophical questions or questions of doubt or whatever, or we're talking about questions about social issues, and there's a lot of those. You can think about that yard sign that a lot of people have, in this house, we believe in science, we believe in tolerance, we believe. That brings up a lot of questions. You're going to look at all of those issues through some lens. You're going to look at all of those issues through some set of beliefs. This is what it means to be human. Nobody's neutral. I know people claim to be neutral. No one's neutral. I know we say things like, well, the science says, and I'm just going to trust the science, but science doesn't say anything. And the moment that science definitively says something, it stops being science, because the very character and nature of science itself is that you're always open to a new way of thinking, a new way of inquiry. You're always open to hypothesis. In our culture, science, we say things like science says, and we basically jump to a conclusion, and it may or may not be a conclusion at all. Another way to say this is science doesn't say anything. Scientists say an awful lot. And scientists say things from a perspective. Their perspective may be true. It may be false. It may be genuine. It may be counterfeit. Things that were considered conclusions at the beginning of the pandemic are now very much up in the air today, and vice versa. And we have conspiracy theories, very real ones, that claim things about things. And so you need to know that we're going to look at these issues, and no one is neutral in looking at these issues. Everyone looks through what can be called a worldview. Now, maybe that word is familiar to you. Maybe it's not. A worldview is kind of like a pair of glasses. Our Lord Bishop has glasses on. Although they do look very good on your face, Lord Bishop, they are not just a fashion accessory. My guess is that they're like what's in, that you can't see, my contact lenses. Contact lenses aren't a fashion accessory. I forget that they're in. My guess is that all of you wearing prescription glasses forget that they're on your face someday. I don't know if you've had that experience yet where you're walking, where are my glasses? And they're right here. Because that's the thing about these glasses. You don't look at them, you look through them. Sometimes we forget that we're all looking through a pair of glasses. I don't mean physical glasses, I mean belief glasses. I mean, we're looking through a set of assumptions about life and the world. And to do this isn't unusual. To do this isn't a problem. It's not a flaw. To do this is human. Our belief glasses are shaped by our families. They're shaped by our culture. They're shaped by our commitments. Sometimes we have taken these glasses off and really examined them and said, well, wait a minute, are these the glasses that I want? And by the way, you want to make sure you have the right glasses. If I took my contacts out and put our Lord Bishop's glasses on, suddenly the world that was clear becomes not clear. In other words, it's not enough to have a set of glasses on your face. It's not enough to have a set of belief glasses as you look at all of these issues and you look at life in the world. You have to have the right prescription. If you have the right worldview, you will see the world clearly. If you have the wrong worldview, then the world gets fuzzy. Things don't make sense. I'll give you an example. Years ago, I was on an airplane and I was coming back from Australia. And that's a long flight. And on the way down to Australia, I got to the airport really, really early in LA, and I was able to get an exit row seat for what was a 12-hour flight. Now, let me just tell you, exit row seats are God's gifts of kindness to people like me who maybe don't quite fit into the average seat. So I was really grateful for this exit row seat, had a great trip down. I did not get an exit row seat on the way back. And I was flying an airline that was not a particularly great airline. So I was back in cattle class, if you know what I mean. And, scrunched in together. And, I sat down next to this lady and I thought, well, I should probably introduce myself because we're going to spend the next 12 hours of our life scrunched together here in a really uncomfortable way. And so we started to talk and I said, well, where are you going? And she said, well, I'm going to Orlando. I said, really, what's in Orlando for you? She said, I'm going to a conference called Avatar. And I was like, well, what's an Avatar conference? And she said, it's a conference where they teach you that all the truth that you need is inside of you. Now, do you see the disconnect here almost immediately? If all the truth is inside of you, why would you pay $2,000 to fly halfway around the world? If all the truth is what you need is already inside of you. Now, we ended up, I didn't ask that. We ended up having this long conversation. She had this clear set of beliefs, and she was actually studying these beliefs and going deeply into these beliefs. And these beliefs were saying, and she kept saying to me, John, you have all the truth. you need inside of you. John, you have all the truth you need inside of you. John, don't let anyone else tell you what's right and wrong. You believe whatever it is that's inside your heart. Now, do you see this other inconsistency? She was telling me that all the truth I need is inside of me, but she's outside of me telling me that truth. So if all the truth that I need is inside of me, why would I listen to her? Do you see the disconnect? Now, I knew where she was coming from. In other words, what was at the root, the fundamental belief that was at the root of all these beliefs. I wasn't sure she'd actually say it, but she did. So this conversation became really a 3-hour conversation. It was really delightful. I know it's, you kind of sometimes think you can't have these conversations, but she was very open and willing, and I was able to stay really calm and have a really good conversation, ask a lot of good questions. She asked a lot of questions of me, and it was pretty good. But about 2 hours into the flight, she looked at me and she said, John, no, you have all the truth inside of you because you are God and I am God. And that flight attendant over there is God. Now, I've been called a lot of things in my life, never God. It's actually a really awkward moment. What do you say when someone says, hey, you're God? Do you say thanks? Do you say no? I mean, it's a really awkward moment. And of course, I was just thinking if I was God, I'd have an exit row seat right now. But anyway, there was a real in other words, we were talking, and it wasn't just that we disagreed on this point or that point or that point. It wasn't just that we disagreed on right and wrong or evolution or something. We had completely different belief classes. We had completely different perspectives about life and the world. And so because we were looking through different glasses, we had different interpretations of reality. Now, I say that, and by the way, there was an interesting moment in the conversation too, a little bit later on, when she kept saying, John, you have all the truth inside you. Don't let anyone else listen to what's right and wrong. And I said, well, wait a minute. Let me assume here for a second that you're right, in which case you'd be wrong, but never mind. Let's assume that you're right. And I decide that what's true and right for me is to torture little babies for fun. Would that be okay? Now, at that point, the people in the row in front of us turned around, and you don't want to say things like that too loud when you're having a conversation that needs a lot of context. But she looked at me and she said, John, why do you have to talk in extremes? I said, well, it's not an extreme. I mean, I read in the news every day about people who think their own pleasure is the highest good, and they torture babies for fun. I mean, whether we're talking about, Coney and warlords who take little kids, child soldiers, or we're talking about Boko Haram who takes little girls, or we're talking about just individuals who abduct. I mean, I think they're desperately wrong. But if anything anyone thinks in their own heart is what's right, how do you say that they're wrong? Do you see the disconnect? In other words, if you have the wrong prescription, if you have the wrong lens through which you're seeing life in the world, you're going to see things incorrect. You're going to interpret the world incorrectly. And maybe you've had that experience too, where you didn't get glasses, you didn't get prescription glasses until like late in life, or 3 or 4 years after you should have had them. And suddenly you put them on and you're like, whoa, I didn't know the world looked like this. I didn't know this was even possible. You see, that's why you have to ask these questions that you have, but you need to do it as if you're going after the truth. And not in a sense of mockery, like there is no truth and no one knows. I'm telling you, have the courage to look carefully at what you believe, because what you believe matters. In fact, one of the most destructive beliefs in our society poses as neutrality. Let me say that again. One of the most destructive beliefs in our society poses as neutrality. It poses as tolerance. It poses as open-mindedness. But it itself is a belief that needs to be examined. You see, it's the belief that it doesn't matter what you believe as long as you believe it in your own heart. It takes these matters of truth and it radically privatizes them. Now, don't get me wrong. I want you to hear me on this. What you believe about God is personal. What you believe about God is personal. Christianity is a personal religion. It's one of the best parts about it. This idea that God, this supernatural creator from which everything derives its existence actually makes himself known, not only to humanity, but to us as people. But Christianity, even if it's personal, it's not private. There's no such thing as my private truth about God and your private truth about God. All right? There's no such thing as what I believe versus what you believe. God makes himself known. He makes himself known publicly. And so what we believe is personal, but it's not private. It has an enormous implication on the rest of the world. One of C.S. Lewis, who's one of my favorite authors, C.S. Lewis once was asked, what's the most profound philosophical statement of all time? And here's what he said. He said, in the beginning, God. Because if that is true, then the entire universe is a different place. Do you see what he was talking about? A.W. Tozer once said something similar. He said, what comes into our minds when we think about God is the most important thing about us. You see, we all have beliefs, but some of those beliefs are fundamental to our lives. Some of those beliefs are the most important beliefs. They are the ones that make up our belief glasses. If you start by thinking that the world was designed, you're going to come up with a very different conclusion than if you start by thinking that the world's an accident. If you start by saying that there's a God out there who actually exists and is really real and has a nature and a character and a purpose and a plan that he reveals through Holy Scripture, that's very different than saying, oh yeah, God exists and I am him. Right? In other words, these beliefs are what philosophers call controlling beliefs. What you believe about them is what you believe about everything else. When we take these fundamental beliefs, like our culture does, and says, well, no one can know the truth. It's impossible to really know. It's just whatever you believe is right for you. What we do is we remove from our lives any sort of fixed reference point. And that's a really dangerous thing, because the best example of this is a compass. A compass works because there is a fixed reference point. And I don't mean like the math compass. I mean like the hike your way out of the wilderness compass, right? This round thing that says north, south, east, west, and it has this little arrow that spins around. And because it's magnetic, it always points to the magnetic North Pole. Now, the reason a compass is so helpful is not because it points which way you should go, and therefore you just follow the arrow. It's because it points specifically to something that is fixed. So no matter how disoriented you are in a jungle or a wilderness, you can always have this fixed reference point that's outside of yourself, outside of your situation, outside of your circumstance. And now you can orient, right? If you need to go east, you know where north is. Now you can know where east is. If you need to go west, you know where north is, so you can go west. And the reason that a compass always points to the north is because there's this fixed, unchanging reference point. No matter how chaotic it is in the jungle, the North Pole is still the North Pole. No matter how chaotic it is, if you're getting chased by a bear in the wilderness, the North Pole is still the North Pole, right? So that's why a compass works. But imagine we dropped you off in the jungles of, Alberta, Canada, or something like that. And we gave you a compass and put a magnet in your backpack so that no matter which way you turned, right, that arrow points at you. You are the center now of reality. There's nothing outside of you. You are the North Pole. Can you find yourself out of a wilderness that way? Can you find yourself out of a jungle that way? Brother, listen. Sister, listen, if you're the North Pole, you're lost. It is a devastating belief in our society that we are told that we are self-defined, that we are self-created, that whatever we believe is true only because we believe it, that we are the center of reality. You need to understand that cultures change. And so you now are in a world that has taken this belief to a whole new level. See, I was growing up, and really the thing was that we were debating culture-wide was whether there was any fixed morality. In other words, if there was any source of what's right and what's wrong that's definitive, that's fixed, that we don't decide, or whether more morality was relative. It was relative to the individual, relative to the situation or circumstance. So really the debate was whether we are the center of determining morality, whether there's a moral law that's higher than us, or whether we determine morality for ourselves. What's happened since I was a kid and now is that we have now moved that debate to a whole different level. It went from wrestling and deciding with whether we are the center of morality, follow me on this, to whether we are the center of reality. It's moved from asking the question whether, if there's no fixed reference point, then we can decide we can decide for ourselves what's right and wrong, to now, if there's no fixed reference point, we can decide reality itself. Our bishop talked this morning about dysphoria. That's the clearest example of this. It's the clearest example of a society that says you can be, not only you can do whatever you want to do, but you are whoever you want to be. You got to understand, it was not a thinkable thought in history 20 years ago to say things like pregnant men. It was not a thinkable thought to say men with vaginas. Now, I'm not trying to be controversial here. I'm not trying to be crude. This is the language. It was not a thinkable thought 40 years ago to say two men and two women's relationship can be considered marriage. Does that make sense? In other words, this comes from a perspective, looking at these various cultural issues, looking at these various ways that people think about life in the world. It's not like Christians are the biased ones and the atheists or the agnostics or the progressives or the whatever, adjective you want to replace Christian with or add to Christian. It's not like they're the neutral ones. Everybody has a set of views about life in the world. And at the root of the difference between our views and other views, or I don't want to say our, because I don't know where you're coming from. Let me say it differently. At the root of the difference between my views as a Christian and other views who see issues like same-sex marriage or like economic issues or faith issues or apologetics issues about the truthfulness of the Bible or who Jesus is. It's not like we're biased and they're not, or I'm biased. Everyone is coming at it from a set of perspectives. And one of the fundamental aspect of our worldview, the fundamental aspect of our perspective is very simple. Is there something fixed? Is there something or someone outside of ourselves that determines reality, or do I create reality in and of myself? Does reality change? There's a lot in our culture right now that we're treating like a speed limit. A speed limit is something that people come up with, like groups of people, get together and they have roads and they have cars. And so they come up with something that is what might be called a social construct. In other words, it's put together as a group of people in order to help govern their lives together, help them live together. And so you might go down a road and it's a 35 mile an hour speed limit. Now, that's not like in reality. That's not like, God didn't create speed limits and evolution didn't give a speed limit. Like, a speed limit is a social construct. If the road is widened from 2 lanes to 4 lanes, and if we get better braking technology on our cars, suddenly it might be completely legitimate to take a speed limit from 35 to 45. Or, I remember the interstates where I grew up in Virginia. We're at 55. That was the speed limit on the interstate when I was growing up. But then things improved and better roads, better cars, better brakes. And I think now it's at 65, in some places even 70. In other words, speed limits aren't fixed. They're social constructs. When the circumstances change, we can change the speed limits. There's all kinds of things right now we're treating like speed limits that aren't, like human nature, like gender, like institutions like marriage, like how we think about our differences, how we think about conflicts, racial conflict. That's one of them. There's so many areas we're treating like speed limits. Let me tell you one thing that you should not treat as a speed limit: gravity. Because gravity is not up for a new social construction. Gravity is not something that changes. Gravity is always gravity. You cannot step off the roof and then choose not to hit the ground. Gravity is not a speed limit. This is one of those things we've got to wrestle with. Do we live in a world of speed limits, or do we live in a world of gravity? Do we live in a world that's fixed, or do we live in a world that's constructed? And no, as we look at all these various issues and you ask all these various questions, which again, please ask all these various questions. Just know that every single person has a perspective, a worldview. Now, it doesn't mean, again, that all worldviews are correct. Some worldviews don't align with reality. Some worldviews can't explain big questions. So let me give you 4 tests, 4 things to use to test a worldview. Okay. These aren't individual tests. These are tests that have to be brought together in order to test your belief system. Here's the first one. It's what we call the test of reason. The test of reason basically recognizes that there are things that aren't true if they are absurd. If I say, for example, out loud, I am a married bachelor, you would think that's absurd. You can't be a married bachelor. If you were to meet my wife and I on the street and you would say, oh, I heard you're expecting another child. And my wife said, yes. And I said, no, you wouldn't think, thank you. That answers my question, and walk away. This is called the law of non-contradiction. I cannot be both married and a bachelor at the same time in the same sense, right? Truth cannot be both relative and absolute in the same time in the same sense. So if a religion, if a worldview, if a belief is absurd, in other words, it violates that law of non-contradiction, then there's really good reason to doubt it. Now, people will sometimes look at Christianity and say, well, the Bible contradicts itself, so therefore it's absurd. So let's look at that. If you have questions about the Bible contradictions, then let's look at it. Let me just tell you what typically happens, though. What typically happens is that someone says, the Bible's full of contradictions. How do you explain that? Whenever anyone says that, I respond with, name one. In other words, you can't just assume that the Bible is full of contradictions unless you can name a contradiction. Saying the Bible is full of contradictions is a cynical, oftentimes a cynical assumption on behalf of somebody who has already moved into the category of mocker. If you have a real question, and by the way, there are some that look like contradictions. There are some that are difficult to resolve. I'm not pretending that they're not. If you got them, let's talk about them. And again, ask Abdu. He's the smart one in this whole conversation. He'll be with us later. No, I'm just kidding. But don't assume that it. Don't assume in the test of reason that there are contradictions if there's not. Okay, that's the first test. Here's the second test. It's called the test of the outer world. There's a lot of people that say, I believe this just because I believe it. It makes me feel good. Well, or I mean the best. Good intentions do not make an idea true. Some of the best intentions can be the most damaging. So if an idea, if a religion, if a worldview is true, you should be able to find proof of it in the real world. We call this the outer world because basically we're talking about the question of evidence. Years ago, there was a cult called the Heaven's Gate cult. It was kind of, I think it was like 1990s. It's called the Heaven's Gate cult. This was a group of people that gathered together in a commune, and there was a comet that went overhead called the Hale-Bop Comet. The Hale-Bop Comet crosses in our view every 70 some years, I think. And this group of people in the Heaven's Gate cult believed that there was a spaceship on the back of that comet. And so they killed themselves. They believed that if they committed mass suicide, then they would be transported to that spaceship that was on the back in the tail of the Hale-Bopp comet. Now, a whole bunch of people were looking at this Hale-Bopp comet. A whole lot of people were watching it come. They watched it cross over. They watched it go. Guess what? They never, ever, ever saw a spaceship. Now, sometimes people, in other words, that was a really risky proposition to kill yourself in order to join the spaceship on the back of the Hale-Bopp comet that no one had seen and there's no evidence for whatsoever. By the way, there's still members of the Heaven's Gate cult today that are waiting for the next time the Hale-Bopp comet goes over so that they can join the spaceship on the end of the comet. That's a really dangerous proposition. Now, a lot of times people will say, well, Christianity doesn't have any evidence. No evidence whatsoever. This is one of the fundamental differences between Christianity and other religions. Christianity claims to be historical. If you look in the Old Testament, there's a lot of historical references. If you go to Israel and start digging, which people actually have, you will figure out whether these claims are true or false. For example, 150 years ago, people assumed that all this kind of grandiose language that the Bible used about David and Solomon couldn't have been true because it was talking about them like they were these great kings. And at best, they were just tribal lords. And now what's happened is 70, 80, 90, 100, 150 years of archaeology digging up there. Guess what they found? They went from not even being sure David existed to thinking David was just a tribal lord to now thinking, yeah, David had a pretty robust big kingdom, kind of like the Old Testament describes. It's fascinating to see what's happening there. In other words, Christianity makes itself open to scrutiny. The central belief of Christianity is open to scrutiny. What's the central belief of Christianity? That Jesus Christ is risen from the dead. You know, it would have been a lot easier for the first followers of Jesus if they were just making this up to say Jesus rose spiritually. Why? Well, because then you don't have to prove that his body actually rose. The body can still be there and Jesus can be in heaven. But that's not what Scripture says. Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 is an early passage. Most scholars, both Christian and skeptical scholars, accept that what you read in 1 Corinthians 15 is a clear statement of early Christian belief. And the first, in other words, dating back within decades of the start of the church. And what they say, and what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15 is that Jesus resurrecting from the dead matters. If he didn't do it, then this whole thing is a farce. This whole thing is bunk. Fascinating, isn't it? That a belief that is the core. What Paul himself says, either he rose from the dead, if he didn't rise from the dead, just forget all this stuff. And it not just a spiritual resurrection, but a bodily. In other words, there's evidence. If you've never really studied the case for the resurrection, you should. The case for the resurrection. And I don't mean the biblical case. I mean the case. I mean the actual case. There's been a bunch of skeptics that have been convinced that Christianity is true just because of that. All right. Test of reason, test of the outer world. Here's the third one, the test of the inner world. The test of the inner world has to explain the human condition. You know, if you're an atheist, you believe that humans basically are animals with a conscience. If humans are animals with a conscience, we do things that animals don't do. In other words, you have to explain the human experience. If you're a Hindu or one of kind of more of the new agey kind of Gaian sort of thing that influences a lot of kind of pop religion in America, you think the humans are gods. It's very popular. Like this lady, the lady that I told you about earlier that was going to an Avatar conference. She believed that she was a god. Not only she was a god, because she was God. She was part of God. Well, there's a lot of things that are God-like about us, but there's also a lot of things that are animal-like about us. What can explain that? If you believe that humans aren't God, if you believe the humans are God, what explains the animal stuff? If you believe the humans aren't God, but just animals with a conscience, what do you believe about all the godlike stuff we do? Like we create and we reason and we invent and we imagine and we care and we sacrifice. Where does all that come from? Blaise Pascal was a 17th century writer, and he said, he actually said, humans are the glory and the garbage of the universe. In other words, Anything that's going to explain the human condition has to explain how humans are capable of great evil and great good, how humans are capable of doing remarkable feats of creativity and destructive feats of evil. What can explain both of those things? Atheism says humans are animals. New Agey stuff says humans are gods. Christianity says humans are made in the image of God and act like animals. That's a pretty good explanation for human behavior and human imagination. So that's the test of the inner world. It's got to make sense. If I'm just C.S. Lewis said, if the world has no meaning, I should have never figured out that it has no meaning. In other words, if this is just a meaningless existence, then I shouldn't have even the category of meaning and purpose and ultimate telos in my life. Okay, so test of reason, test of the outer world, test of the inner world. Last one, and I'm done right on time if I get this done in 30 seconds or less. Ready? The test of the real world. Sometimes ideas look great on paper until they're lived out. Classic example of this in the 20th century was Marxism. Marxism was a set of ideas designed to lift up the poor. The result of Marxism is that everywhere that it was tried, it became a force of totalitarianism and dehumanization. More people were slaughtered at the hands of communist governments in the 20th century than all the other worldviews, all the other centuries combined. I mean, it's an amazing thing what we saw from Chairman Mao, what we saw in the killing fields of Cambodia, what we saw from Lenin and Stalin, what we're seeing right now from China in the Olympics, the cynical, let's hold up a Uyghur minority to light the Olympic flames while millions of Uyghurs are in concentration camps subject to what most people would say fits the definition of genocide. In other words, what does this ideal look like when it's lived out? I think that can apply to all kinds of beliefs about gender, about sexuality, but it also needs to apply to beliefs from Christianity. What does it look like when you live out that thing? Love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. One of the things that Abdu's going to address later is a reputation that Christianity has. That Christianity has been a force for evil, not for good. That Christianity has, because it's intolerant, because all the other things that Christianity is accused of, then you can't say that Christianity is something that's good for the world. Well, let's test it. Let's look at the test of the real world. So I say all this to invite your questions, my friends. Please ask them. Ask the hard ones. Questioning is okay. Jesus invites your questions, but do it as a seeker, not as a mocker. Do it as someone who's courageous enough, brave enough to accept the truth if it's there, not as a cynic who's already made up his mind or her mind. Thank you so much. It's great to be with you. And trust me, you're going to love Abdu Murray. Abdu is a very good friend of mine. He's a brilliant thinker and a brilliant speaker. And you're really going to appreciate what he does. He's not an Anglican yet, but we'll work on that today. All right, I'll hand that over. Now I'll hand it over to whoever our MC is here. Thank you so much.